When the ancient Romans looked back at their earliest history and the foundation of Rome as a state, or even as an idea, they didn't really have much to look back on. The time period in which Rome was founded, according to legend and according to some archaeological evidence that we have, was a time period where writing was not common. That's not to say writing hadn't been invented yet, but the Romans were not writing literature in their earliest days the way that they were during later periods. And as a result, all they had about their earliest history, or most of what they had about their earliest history, came from oral tradition, stories being passed down and shared from generation to generation. But in later periods of Roman history, especially in periods of instability, as we'll look at in this video, it became very important for the Romans to be able to say something about themselves as a people. And the foundation stories of the state of Rome, of the idea that was Rome, became even more important. And they were used as a tool to get certain messages about cultural identity across. And what could be more important for constructing an identity than the birth of your founders? Rome has two founders, Romulus and Remus. Romulus is obviously the more important one, and he gives his name to Rome. But Romulus and Remus are twins. And the story about their birth and their early childhood became one of the most widely discussed parts of the Roman foundation story. So today we will be diving into the birth of Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of the city of Rome, and in particular we are going to be looking at the women who brought them up, who brought them into the world and who cared for them when they were young. You may know that there are different accounts of who their father was. Some say it was the god Mars, others say that it was their mother's uncle, and so on. We'll get into all that. But in addition to having multiple potential fathers, Romulus and Remus had 3 mothers. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at each of these women and their portion of the myth and discuss how they all play into the story. And in order to do this, we have to look at a lot of different sources. Like I said, this story has been covered many, many, many times in antiquity, not to mention the mountain of scholarship written on the subject. So how we're going to structure this video today to make it hopefully at least a little bit organized is we're going to begin by looking at the sources themselves. We're going to go through when everything was written, who was writing, what parts of the story, and so on. Then we'll switch to talking about the myth itself. So I'll present what I hope can be a kind of chronological account of the events in the myth, and then we'll discuss everything at the end, and I'll give you a little bit of scholarship. Everything that I talk about, as always, is going to be listed in the description where you can find these sources if you want to read along. And I do have a little scholarship section at the end of the video, but I want to say up front that there is one article in particular that influenced me tremendously when I was putting this video together, and that is this article here. You can see it on the screen. It's called Virgins and Prostitutes in Roman Mythology, and what the authors of this article do is they take 3 stories from Rome's mythohistory / actual history that feature both sides of the feminine sexual spectrum, if you will. The virgins, usually Vestal virgins, obviously of great interest to me, and sex workers. And they look at how the two play together in these different stories. And I love this article. I read this for the Vesta class. I had encountered it before. It has guided me through a lot of projects, and I really, really, really like it. So I will be using this extensively throughout the video, but I also will have other articles that I list towards the end. If you want to find this article, to my knowledge, JSTOR, which is an online database of academic articles, to my knowledge, they are still doing their COVID promotion, which is that you can create a free account and get 100 free articles every month. If you're reading more than that, I don't know how you're doing it. You can log on and you can read this article for yourself on JSTOR. And I love JSTOR so much, and so I'm very, very, very happy that they're doing this, that they have been doing this promotion now for many years, and I think it's fabulous. So if you have any interest in reading academic articles and you don't know about this, here it is. Highly recommend. With that all being said, like I said, I'm going to start by talking about our sources, then we'll get into the myth, and then we'll discuss it at the very end. So, as per usual, big chunk of information to get into today, so let me stop yapping and let's just get into it. We have two types of ancient sources for this myth. The first is sources that we have in fact. We have recovered the text of these authors, preserved in medieval manuscripts or however we have it. And so we're able to read their words directly. And then we have sources that we actually don't have in fact, but who are cited by other ancient authors. So, for example, we don't have a ton of Aeneas, but we do have a lot of fragments of Aeneas cited by other authors like Cicero and Servius and so on. And one thing to note about this story is that each author puts their own spin on it. So, not all of the details align, there are variations. There are certainly some things that most authors agree on, but the specifics of each author's version of it give us kind of a wide range of what the story actually says. Now, because this is mytho-history, it's impossible to know what the, quote, real story is, and it's probably not very good to talk about a real version of it. This is a myth. And so what's important about looking at each version of the story is more about how the author treats the story itself rather than what the quote-unquote real story might have been. So when I present the myth, I will be presenting variations, and we can discuss what those variations do to the story as we go. So here is what I'm sure is an incomplete list of ancient sources that cover this myth. If you know of any others that I missed, drop them down below. I tried to pick the sources that cover this myth in more detail, and there's some that I'm going to be citing extensively, and there's some that I'm going to be citing not very much at all. And as I said, you can find all of these in the description down below. I've listed English versions of them, except for Servius. I did put an English version if you want to, like, buy an English version of Servius, but I couldn't find one online. Truthfully, I didn't look very hard because Latin is something that I happen to be able to read. So I have provided my own translations for the parts of Servius that I am citing. Otherwise, everything else down below is in English. So this story appears in the earliest Roman writing that we have. So the first set of sources comes from the Roman Republic, and it ranges from the 3rd century BCE all the way up to the transition from Republic to Empire. And like I said, most of the sources from the Republic, we don't actually have them. We have versions of them or sections of them that are quoted by other people. Fabius Pictor, Aeneas, probably the most famous of these, he writes an epic about Roman history. Wow, I wish we had that. And Valerius Antias and Licinius Macer, all of these guys wrote stuff that we don't have. The only one from the Roman Republic that we have is Cicero, who gives us a big chunk of Aeneas in his De Divinatione. But otherwise, all of these guys are quoted in, say Dionysius of Halicarnassus will say something like, as Fabius Pictor reports, or as Valerius Antias says, and so we get them indirectly. When we get to the Augustan period, this situation changes because we have so much writing from this period. So Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Livy, Ovid, these guys are writing in a time where the arts were flourishing. They were being supported by Augustus and by his sort of elite social club. And there was a concerted effort to use writing and poetry and storytelling as a way to reconstruct a sense of Roman identity, a sense of Roman unity after several generations of civil war and chaos. Augustus inherited a mess. He's trying to create something out of that mess. Now, he does this by dismantling the Republic, which was already on its last legs, and creating effectively a monarchy, for better or worse. But part of that process was to look at Rome's earliest history and explain to people that we have been here in this land for centuries at this point, 750 years, maybe more, and we are all Roman people. So all of that to say that we have writing from this period directly that treats this myth. So Dionysius of Halicarnassus was a historian and a teacher of rhetoric. He wrote a work called The Roman Antiquities, which is written in Greek, but it begins from the foundation of Rome and it goes up to the Punic Wars, and he cites a lot of other authors. So we have his version of things and we have his report of what other people are saying. Livy is probably the most famous historian of this period because his work is usually used in Latin classes. So if you've taken Latin in any sort of formal way, you've probably encountered him before. Livy writes a history of Rome from the foundation up to his own day. Ovid gets in on the action as well. Ovid's primarily a love poet. He writes amorous poetry, we'll say, including his Amores, which is a series of love poems, but he does treat part of this myth in one of the Amores, and then his Fasti, which is about the religious calendar. After Augustus, the tradition of the birth of Romulus and Remus carries on. It takes on a life of its own. You get a lot of other authors that are citing the earliest authors, maybe even not by name, but they're repeating the same versions that we already know about from the earlier sources. And then you get some weird stuff in there too. So one of the most significant sources for the story is Plutarch, who wrote so many things. He was a philosopher, he was a priest at Delphi, priest of Apollo who worked with the oracle at Delphi. Pretty cool. But he's known primarily as a biographer, and so he writes a biography of Romulus, which obviously tells about the birth of Romulus, so that's important. Then you have Aulus Gellius. I'm not going to talk about Aulus Gellius so much because his version is like way different. It's not so much about the birth of Romulus as it is about Romulus and Remus's third mother, Acca Larentia, which we'll get to. He tells like a wild alternative version, so I'll mention it, but that's like, as far as I know, that's an outlier. Cassius Dio. If you didn't see my interview with my husband, he wrote his dissertation recently on Cassius Dio, so you can hear us talk about that and the time period. I'll link that up above and down below. Cassius Dio also writes a history of Rome from the foundation all the way up to his own time, but the early books are very corrupted, meaning that the texts are not we don't have them in any sort of complete form. We have them in what is called epitome, which is basically other people summarizing it. We're lucky to have any of it at all, but it is incomplete. Then you have Servius, who comes later, and he is incredibly useful because he writes commentaries on ancient works which are ancient to us, but at that point were also ancient to him, including the Aeneid. So we'll use his commentary on the Aeneid. And then lastly, there's a later text, which, again, we're lucky to have this at all. It exists only in 2 manuscripts, and it's called the Origo Gentis Romani, the origin of the Roman people. We don't know who wrote it, but it cites other ancient authors, including some of the earliest authors that we talk about, Valerius Antias, for example, and it gives a few different versions of how the whole thing shook out. So we'll use that pretty extensively as well. Let's turn now to the myth itself. Like I said, this is a pretty convoluted story. There's lots of alternative versions. I'm going to do my best to present a cohesive narrative that we can digest later, but as I go through, I'll be presenting kind of alternative things here and there. And because we have so many sources, I will be reading quotes directly, but I'm going to have even more quotes on the screen as I go through. So it's time to meet the first mother of Romulus and Remus. This is their birth mother. She's known by a number of names. I know her primarily by the name of Rhea Silvia, so that's the one that I'm going to be using throughout. But she does have a number of names, so let's take a look at those really quickly. So Rhea is a mother goddess. She is the daughter of Gaia, Mother Earth. This is Greek mythology. These are Greek names. She's the wife of Kronos, and she is the mother of the Olympian gods. So the 6 siblings, including Zeus, the king of the gods, and his brothers and sisters, Hestia, Hera, Demeter, Poseidon, Hades, and Zeus himself. Rhea's place in mythology is primarily to give birth to these gods, and that is her function, so it makes sense that her name would be tied into the name of the mother of the entire Roman state. Now, a couple of sources, the Origogentis and Livy, have Rhea Silvia's grandfather as a guy named Silvius Procas, so Silvia might just be a family name. There are a number of Silvii people in Livy in particular, but the word Silwa also means forest, and there was a minor woodland deity who was associated with Faunus, or identified with Faunus and other woodland deities, and his name was Silwanus. So you have kind of 2 things happening here. You have the family name, but then you also have her connection to the woodlands. And we'll see this is a very sylvan story. There's a lot of woodland elements in it. But then she has another name, and some sources use this exclusively as her name, and that is Ilia. Ilia is a callback to another name for the city of Troy, Ilium. So if you've read the Iliad, it is the story of Troy and the Trojan War. So calling her Ilia places her in the Trojan history. Now, these people are supposed to be related to Aeneas, who is a refugee from Troy who comes and sets up a city in Italy that will give birth to, the family line that eventually Rome comes out of. So this is a callback to the Trojan ancestry of this particular family. It's also interesting to note that, especially I find in Ovid, elsewhere as well in Augustan sources, but really especially in Ovid, the goddess Vesta, shocker, I'm talking about Vesta. Vesta is associated with Troy as well. Some sources have her coming from Troy. The Aeneid has Aeneas actually bringing her worship from Troy to Italy. And so she is also sometimes called the Ilian goddess. And her fire is the Ilian fire, and her hearth is the Ilian hearth. So it ties Rhea Silvia to the goddess Vesta, and in the story, Rhea Silvia is in fact a Vestal priestess, so this would make sense. Now, various sources call her by any of these names. Cassius Dio says Rhea Ilia, also called Silvia. Most sources say that Rhea Silvia is the daughter of Numitor, who in many versions is the king of Alba Longa, or at least the rightful king of Alba Longa. So Rhea Silvia is a priestess. She comes from a royal lineage. Aeneas says that she's the daughter of Aeneas himself, which means that Romulus and Remus are Aeneas's grandsons, rather than in the more popular version that they are his, distant descendants. And in the fragment of Aeneas that we have from Cicero, he recounts a dream that Rhea Silvia or Ilia had, where her father Aeneas appeared to her to give her some information, which we'll get to. But in any case, she's related to Aeneas, and of course Aeneas's mother is Venus, Aeneas has her actually appeal to Venus for help at one point, but because it's so fragmentary, we don't really have much of that. The crux of all of it is that the authors are trying to draw a connection between Romulus and Remus and their ancestry going back to Troy, because this was a big part of Roman identity, is that we are refugees from the Trojan War. Okay, backstory out of the way. The conflict between Rhea Silvia's father Numitor and his brother Amulius is the catalyzing event in the story of Romulus and Remus. Like I said, Numitor in most versions is the rightful king of this city called Alba Longa, which is founded by Aeneas and his descendants. And he has a brother, this guy called Amulius. In most versions, Numitor is the rightful king, and he is overthrown by Amulius, who is like his evil usurping brother. Amulius forcibly takes power, kicks Numitor out, throws him in prison, and then he is illegitimately ruling in Alba Longa. That's how most versions tell it. So Ovid says, when Amulius, despiser of justice, found out about this, for, as victor, he held the power he had seized from his brother. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, when Amulius succeeded to the kingdom of the Albans after forcibly excluding his elder brother Numitor from the dignity that was his by inheritance, and so on. Livy, to Numitor the elder he, meaning their father, bequeathed the ancient throne of the Silvian house. Violence, however, proved stronger than either the father's will or the respect due to the brother's seniority, for Amulius expelled his brother and seized the crown. And Dio, Numitor while king was driven out by Amulius. So that's how the story usually goes. But in the version presented by Plutarch, which is also picked up by the Origogentis, Amulius ends up dividing their inheritance into two packages. So one brother will inherit the throne and all of the power that comes along with it, and the other brother will inherit the wealth and not the power, but he'll have a bunch of money. In Plutarch's version, Numitor chooses the kingdom, giving Amulius all the wealth, but then once he has the wealth, he's able to drum up enough support to overthrow Numitor, so he ends up with all of it anyway. In the Origogentis, Numitor just decided that he wanted a quiet life of luxury, so he picked the wealth, and he gave Amulius the throne. Once Amulius comes to power, however that ends up happening, he wants to secure himself. And so the way that he does this is he goes after Numitor's children. In Dio's version, he lives in fear of a prophecy that was given that he would end up dying at the hands of Numitor's offspring. So he wants to nip that in the bud. This is like a classic ancient Greek, ancient Roman mythological trope that Dio is putting here. He's the only one that includes this. Everybody else basically just says that Amulius wants to secure himself, and so he goes after Numitor's children. This, of course, includes Rhea Silvia, but in some versions, Numitor also has a son that Amulius just kills outright. His name is Aegestus. And then he has to figure out what to do about Numitor's daughter. So in pretty much every version, he makes her a Vestal Virgin priestess. And the idea is that these priestesses are chaste, they are abstinent, and so she will not have any children that will potentially overthrow him because they are the rightful claimants to the throne. And the Origogentis says that the way that he does this is he pretends that he received a dream from the goddess Vesta herself, where she tells him to make Rhea Silvia a priestess of her cult, but in fact, as the Origogentis goes on to say, Amulius just wanted to prevent her from having any children who would be rightful claimants to the throne. So Amulius has the throne, Numitor is in prison, Numitor's son, Aegestus, has been killed, and Rhea Silvia has been made a chaste priestess. And yet, we know that Rhea Silvia is the mother of Romulus and Remus, so somehow she ends up pregnant anyway. The story of how this happened is A, the most famous part of the story, and B, the most convoluted part of the story because everybody has ideas about how this happened, and C, the reason there are so many different versions is because if a Vestal virgin becomes pregnant, lots of people have a lot of explaining to do. So you have ancient authors saying who they think the real father is. You have characters in the story saying who they think the real father is and how it all went down. And so I present to you now a million different versions of this. Plutarch's version is the simplest. She was discovered to be with child. Very nice. The story goes that Rhea Silvia was going down to a grove that was sacred to Mars, wink wink, Mars, to get some water, probably for ritual purposes. And that while she's there, she somehow becomes pregnant. And it's generally agreed that she was forced, even in sources that don't name the father. So Livy says the Vestal was forcibly violated and gave birth to twins. Dionysius of Halicarnassus says, the 4th year after this, Ilia, upon going to a grove consecrated to Mars to fetch pure water for use in the sacrifices, was ravished by somebody or other in the sacred precinct. Some say that the author of the deed was one of the maiden's suitors who was carried away by his passion for the girl. But a lot of sources do name a father, and the most popular version has Mars, the god Mars, as the father. Having Mars as the father has really good implications. It's a beautiful little poetic thing because they're also, Romulus and Remus are also related to the goddess Venus. So you have love and war, which is a big dichotomy in Roman literature, especially Roman love poetry, especially Ovid's love poetry. Yada yada, I love it. Most sources name Mars as the father. So Ovid's Fasti, Mars sees her, desires what he's seen, and takes possession of what he's desired. And then he later calls Romulus and Remus the offspring of Mars. Servius says, quote, she, as many say, Mars, the verb here, literally it means like compressed, but it's more like overpowered. Mars overpowered her, from which were born Remus and Romulus. And then Dionysius of Halicarnassus fleshes this out a whole bunch. He says, but most writers relate a fabulous story to the effect that it was a spectre of the divinity to whom the place was consecrated. And they add that the advantageous was attended by many supernatural signs, including a sudden disappearance of the sun and a darkness that spread over the sky, and that the appearance of the spectre was far more marvelous than that of a man, both in stature and in beauty. Now he goes on to say that, whenever you start speculating on the nature of the gods, it gets a little bit hazy and you probably shouldn't be doing that. But his inclusion of the signs and symbols makes it very much a visitation by a deity. And the Origogentis picks up on that. They talk about rain showers and thunder and everything, indicating that the god was the one who did this. Now, Livy thinks that she might have made the Mars thing up, that she presented Mars as the father in order to sanitize what had happened, because she's not supposed to get pregnant. And if you know anything about the Vestals, which I know many of you do because I can't stop talking about them, the Vestals are punished severely for breaking their vow of chastity, whether they consented or not. So for Rhea Silvia, she has to come up with an explanation for this. And Livy says, she named Mars as their father, either because she really believed it, or because the fault might appear less heinous if a deity were the cause of it. But of course, there's another possibility, and a couple of sources say that the father is actually someone a whole lot worse than the god Mars, and that is, in fact, her uncle Amulius. That even though he locked her away to prevent her from becoming pregnant, he could not help himself, and he was the one that assaulted her. And not only that he dressed up in armor in order to disguise himself so that, maybe she thought it was the god Mars, but it actually was just him. So Dionysius of Halicarnassus says, others say that it was Amulius himself, and that, since his purpose was to destroy her quite as much as to satisfy his passion, he had arrayed himself in such armor as would render him most terrible to behold, and that he also kept his features disguised as effectively as possible. And of course, it matters for the symbolism of the story which of these fathers is the actual father. And again, when we say actual father, we're not talking about an actual historical reality, but what do people believe about their own foundation? If the father is the god Mars, that's pretty awesome, because then not only does your founder hero have a divine ancestor in the form of the goddess Venus, but also his actual father is a god himself, which makes Romulus a demigod, which makes him more powerful. So it does kind of matter. And also the versions that have Amulius as the father, that makes it way darker of a story. I'm not going to dwell on that too much, but I mean, that's horrific. And it adds to the poignancy of the tragedy of Rhea Silvia. I'm gonna skip over, I had some stuff in here about versions where Mars or Aeneas, in the versions where Aeneas is her father, appears to her in a dream, either Mars or Aeneas, and explains to her that her children are going to be special. I'm not going to get into it too much because of time, but there are a couple versions where that shows up. And then also, just to put a pin in the Mars thing, some versions use the wolf story, which we'll get into it in a second, and also the presence of a woodpecker, both of which are sacred animals to Mars, as a way to kind of give credence to the Mars thing. You know, even in Ovid's Fasti, where you just get Rhea Silvia having a dream about two palm trees, the wolf and the woodpecker show up in the dream, so it ties it all to Mars. Regardless of who the father is, Rhea Silvia, the Vestal Virgin Priestess, becomes pregnant, and this becomes a problem for her. Like I said, Vestals were punished for inchastity, and so in some versions, Rhea Silvia is killed outright. This is a normal punishment for the Vestals, that she is killed. And a lot of sources have her thrown into the river, especially the Tiber River, thrown into the Tiber River and killed. In other versions, she's put in prison. In some versions, she's going to be killed, but Amulius has a daughter who would be Rhea Silvia's first cousin, and because they loved each other very much and they grew up together, she intercedes on Rhea Silvia's behalf. And so instead of being killed, Rhea Silvia is just locked away and put in prison. But in every version, the boys are taken away from Rhea Silvia after they are born. After they're taken away from their mother, the boys are exposed. This is an unfortunate yet common practice in antiquity of getting rid of unwanted children, which was to basically leave them out in nature and assume that they are not going to survive. I think, and I'm sure that people have written about this, I'm sure that this is related to ritual purity in the same way that Vestal virgins were buried alive, not like what you're imagining. They were left in a pit with some food and water that would eventually run out and they would die, but the people doing it wouldn't incur the ritual impurity of murdering them. I'm assuming it's the same with exposure. You put the children out, I don't know what happened to them, I just left them, and I don't know. So you don't have the ritual impurity on you. That doesn't make me feel any better, but I'm assuming that that's what that's all about. So these boys are exposed. They're put in a basket and they are sent along the Tiber River, again with the assumption that they are not going to survive. But the Tiber River is prone to flooding, and in most versions, the river floods and the basket that the boys are in washes up on the shore and they don't end up drowning. And Ovid, in his usual way, because remember also that rivers are gods like everything else, in his usual poetic way says, he, meaning Amulius, orders the twins to be drowned in the river. The water shrank from the crime. the children are abandoned on dry land. There's a sense of inevitably driving towards the fate of Romulus and Remus, which is not to die, it is to found what will become the Roman Empire. Oh, and I should point out that the Origogentis has an alternative version for this and says that Numitor, the grandfather of the boys, knew the whole time that Rhea Silvia was pregnant, that she gave birth to twins, yada yada yada. So when Amulius gave the order for them to be exposed, Numitor secretly switched them with other babies. I mean, it sucks for the other babies, but switched them and saved Romulus and Remus, and so it was actually 2 other children that were exposed. But again, in most versions, the actual children of Rhea Silvia are exposed. The Tiber floods, they are left on the riverbank. And we will leave them there for a moment to close out the story of Rhea Silvia, because after this, as I said, the boys are taken from her, and a couple of stories pick up after this to say what happened to her kind of in the end. So Rhea Silvia, although when you get to this part of the story, her name more often than not is Ilia, somehow becomes involved with a river. Either the river Anio or the river Tiber. And she is either married to the river, or she throws herself in the river and drowns, or she is drowned in the river. One of these 2 rivers. And some versions have it as both. So Aeneas, in a fragment that's summarized by Porphyry, says, quote, "According to Aeneas's account, Ilia was thrown headlong into the river Tiber by order of Amulius, king of the Albans, but before this she was joined in marriage to the Anio." And then immediately after that, there's a fragment summarized by Servius that says that she was married to the Tiber. So you see already it's convoluted. Horace even gets in on the action. He says, "We see the yellow Tiber, with its waves violently turned back from the Etruscan shore, going tossed back against the monuments of the king and the temples of Vesta." And again, we have a Vesta thing here. "While he places himself as an avenger for Ilia, who lamented much, and wandering, he laps the shore on the left side without Jupiter's approval, the river who loved his wife." That's the best translation I could come up with for uxorious, the guy who loved his wife. It means like a wifely guy. So that's a pretty cool version. But the most moving and stirring version of this, you'll be surprised to hear I'm going to read from Ovid, but it's the Amores and not the Fausti. So Ovid's Amores, number 3.6, is a story of Ovid wanting to cross a river, and he can't cross it, so he starts like berating the river with all these other myths of rivers who were in love, basically. And the longest one, and the one that he ends with, is the story of Ilia. So I'm probably not going to read the whole thing, but I'll read parts of it. He says, "Then there's Anio, tumbling down through rocks amid Tiber's orchards. He lost his heart to Ilia, didn't mind her unkempt appearance, the grief-stricken way she tore at her cheeks and hair as she wandered barefoot through the wilderness, mourning Mars's lust and her uncle's crime. At the sight of her, swift-flowing Aeneo's head surged upwards from his loud mid-waters, and thus he spoke. 'Oh, why do you pace my banks so forlornly, Ilia, daughter of Ilium's royal line?' In case anybody didn't catch the reference. 'Why must you wander alone, your finery discarded, hair falling down your back, no white ribbon to bind it?' The white ribbon is a Vestal thing. 'Why are you crying? Why in such frenzy beating your naked breast?' And he goes on and on and on from there. And he proposes marriage to her. 'My palace is ready for you. My waters will do you honor. Ilia, don't be afraid. Don't reject me. Not that, I beseech you, dear Trojan lady,' in case you didn't get the reference. 'Say yes, and you'll reap a still richer reward than all that I have promised.' And Ilia is not particularly interested in marrying this river because she is in such a state of despair. after being assaulted by the god, and then all of the trouble with Amulius and her children have been taken from her. And in this version in particular, she's very upset about her vows being broken, her vows to Vesta. So she says, "Oh, that my bones had been gathered and laid to rest in the tomb of my ancestors while I was a virgin still. Ah, why this offer of marriage? My vows, I broke my vows as a vestal, whorish, unclean, no right to the sacred fire. Why linger a butt for cheap pointing fingers? The brand of shame is on my face, so wipe it out." With that, she raised up her robe before her swollen eyes and hurled herself into the swift flood. So she attempts to kill herself, but Aeneas feels bad for her, and also he loves her, presumably, so he saves her and makes her his wife, and I think the assumption here is that she becomes like a river nymph. I don't know for sure, I don't think it's clear in the text, but this has to be what happens. So that is the end of the Rhea Silvia portion of this story. Romulus and Remus's first mother, their birth mother, is a woman who comes from a royal line who is not supposed to be pregnant, ends up pregnant, and the children are taken from her, and she has some kind of tragic end, whether she's killed outright or she ends up connected to this river somehow. In any case, it's a tragic note to end her story on. But her place in the mytho-historical canon is, name a more significant woman from Roman mytho-history, at least the foundational mytho-history. I can't think of one. Lucretia, maybe, but Rhea Silvia is the woman who gives birth to the person who embodies Rome itself. He gives Rome its name, he gives Rome its senate and its structure and its military and all of these things that the Roman people are looking back on. And Rhea Silvia herself, she already has these divine connections through Aeneas up to Venus, and even her being assaulted by Mars brings even more gravitas to the situation at hand. So in many ways her story is horrible and tragic, and in other ways she symbolizes everything for Rome. Everything. And so that's where we will leave Rhea Silvia behind, at least for now. We're already pretty deep into this video, but the Rhea Silvia portion of the story is the longest and most convoluted part of the story because it's actually the birth of Romulus and Remus. But if you'll remember, we left them on a riverbank, and I'm sure many of you know what's coming next. The second mother figure helps Romulus and Remus when they are at their most vulnerable, and she represents the most iconic visual image of their childhood. I'm talking, of course, about the wolf, who found the boys after they were exposed and sent up the Tiber River. The Tiber flooded, they ended up on the banks, and a wolf came along and discovered them. If a wolf discovers unattended human children in the wild, you might expect something horrible to happen. But in this story, the wolf does something very unexpected. She cares for the boys. She licks them clean, and she even offers her own body to nurse them, to give them food. And in some versions, the woodpecker shows up here, where the woodpecker is also bringing food to the boys. But she takes care of them until they're found by people. This is an iconic moment in the story. Ovid says, "Who does not know that the infants grew on the milk of a wild creature, and that a woodpecker often brought the foundlings food?" There is much less variation in this portion of the story. It's really just minor details. So what I'll do is I'm going to read you Dionysius of Halicarnassus's version because I find it the most extensive and the most moving. So this is what he says. "Upon this, a she-wolf that had just whelped appeared, and, her udder being distended with milk, gave them her paps to suck, and with her tongue licked off the mud with which they were besmeared. In the meantime, the herdsmen happened to be driving their flocks forth to pasture, for this place was now become passable, and one of them, seeing the wolf thus fondling the babes, was for some time struck dumb with astonishment and disbelief of what he saw. Then going away and getting together as many as he could of his fellows, who kept their herds near at hand, for they would not believe what he said, he led them to see the sight themselves. When these also drew near, and saw the wolf caring for the babes as if they had been her young, and the babes clinging to her as to their mother, they thought they were beholding a supernatural sight, and advanced in a body, shouting to terrify the creature. The wolf, however, far from being provoked at the approach of the men, but as if she had been tame, withdrew gently from the babes and went away, paying little heed to the rabble of shepherds. Now, there was not far off a holy place, arched over by a dense wood, and a hollow rock from which springs issued. The wood was said to be consecrated to Pan, and there was an altar there to that god. To this place, then, the wolf came and hid herself. The grove, to be sure, no longer remains, but the cave from which the spring flows is still pointed out, built up against the side of the Palatine Hill on the road which leads to the circus, and near it is a sacred precinct in which there is a statue commemorating the incident. It represents a she-wolf suckling 2 infants, the figures being in bronze and of ancient workmanship. This spot is said to have been a holy place of the Arcadians, who formerly settled there with Evander. The image of the boys being nursed by a wolf is, like I said, it's one of the most iconic visual representations of this story. The most famous statue is the Capitoline wolf, which the dating of it is controversial. I'm not like a real archaeologist, so I don't really know like the whole controversy behind that. It could be medieval, parts of it could be ancient, and it could have been added to. This is like one of the most famous images of Rome's mytho-history. And I'll just throw in another of my favorite statues, which is the boys hanging out with the wolf, and the giant god is the god of the Tiber River. Alright, so can you imagine seeing something like this? This is a really fantastical element in the story, and I will have a lot more to say about this part when we get to the analysis of the story itself, but just imagine how spectacular and unexpected this is. It adds to the lore that Romulus and Remus are not ordinary children, and that their destiny is secure. Because despite being thrown in a river, despite being left out to the elements and being discovered by a predator in the wild, the land itself seems to protect them and nurture them, and so on and so forth. And of course, the wolf is sacred to Mars, the woodpecker as well. And so you get the sense that these are supernatural children. And they are. Now, not all versions include the story of the wolf, and those that don't include it, or include it only to refute it and say, never happened, those sources give an alternate explanation for why people might have thought that the wolf was involved. And we'll get to that now because, believe it or not, short and sweet, we're done with the wolf part of the story, and I'm going to introduce you to Romulus and Remus's third mother. The third mother of Romulus and Remus, who we might call their adoptive mother, is a woman called Acca Larentia. She is the wife of a shepherd named Faustulus, and she ends up taking the boys in and raising them until they are adults. These are humble people. They come from a low socioeconomic class. In some versions, they're even called slaves. Faustulus is a herdsman in the service of either Amulius or Numitor or whoever, which may have been an enslaved position. It sort of depends. So in a few versions, Acca Larentia herself is a mother, but unfortunately, when she gives birth to her child or to her children, they are stillborn. So Cassius Dio says, the babes were given to Faustulus, a shepherd, husband of Larentia, to be exposed by the Tiber River. These the shepherd's wife took and reared, for it happened that she had at the time borne a dead child. So we begin with tragedy and loss in the story of Acca Larentia, but unexpectedly, through her husband, she ends up gaining 2 children who are not her own children, but who she ends up taking in and raising to be adults. Faustulus comes upon the children in most versions. As we just heard in Dio, he's actually the one that is sent to expose the children in the first place, and then he just doesn't. But that's Dio is like the only one that says that. So I'm going to call that an outlier. And here's another outlier. This is Dionysius of Halicarnassus. And again, he gives the kind of most robust version of the story. So this is what he says. There was among them the keeper of the royal herds of swine, whose name was Faustulus, an upright man who had been in town upon some necessary business at the time when the deflowering of Ilia and her delivery were made public. And afterwards, when the babes were being carried to the river, he had by some providential chance taken the same road to the Palatine Hill and gone along with those who were carrying them. This man, without giving the least intimation to the others that he knew anything of the affair, asked that the babes might be delivered to him, and having received them by general consent, he carried them home to his wife. And finding that she had just given birth to a child, and was grieving because it was stillborn, he comforted her and gave her these children to substitute in its place, informing her of every circumstance of their fortune from the beginning. So Romulus and Remus are raised in the countryside. Again, this is a reasonably common origin story for heroes. We'll get to some hardcore comparisons towards the end of the video, but if you've ever seen like Disney's Hercules, that's one where Hercules is raised by adoptive parents who are humble and live in the country, and so he's kind of raised away from the action. And then at a certain point he realizes who he is and what his destiny is, and then he goes on to pursue what his actual life is supposed to be. This is pretty common. We see it here again with Romulus and Remus, who are taken away from a royal context and are raised outside of the action. Jason and the Argonauts is another one where Jason is sent away. And again, you have royal brothers who are fighting over the throne. Jason is sent away as a baby to hang out with Chiron, who is not only a fantastical creature, but also is like a tutor and a representative of living out in nature. And then Jason comes back to fulfill his destiny later on. Now, I said that not every author who treats this story includes the part about the boys being nursed by the wolf, and that some authors present a rationalizing explanation for how that part of the story came to be. And the reason for this is because the word for wolf in Latin is lupa. And the word lupa was slang in antiquity for, I think broadly you could say, a sexually liberated woman. Professionally or recreationally, a woman who used her body either to make a profit, and this runs the gamut from like women on the street all the way to like high-level courtesans, but also just a woman who slept around. Some authors want it to be the case that Acca Larentia is either a professional sex worker or she just kind of made her way around the farmers. And so in calling her a lupa, that's where the wolf comes from. So you have Servius. These boys the shepherd Faustus discovered, whose wedded wife was the meretrix Acca Larentia, who nursed the boys after taking them in. and meretrix is the word for sex worker. You have Plutarch, who says, "But some say that the name of the children's nurse, by its ambiguity, deflected the story into the fabulous. For the Latins not only called she-wolves lupi, but also women of loose character. And such a woman was the wife of Faustulus, the foster father of the infants, Acca Larentia by name." And the Origogentis, "Because she was accustomed to make her body available to all for a price, she was called a she-wolf. It is to be noted, indeed, that women who make profit by the body are thus named, whence, too, spots of this sort in which these women do business are called dens of she-wolves." These different characterizations of Acca Larentia, from the grieving mother who gave birth to a stillborn child to a woman who is called a she-wolf because she sleeps around, these change the character of the story a little bit. That article that I mentioned at the beginning, the Virgins and Prostitutes article, obviously they would have a lot to say about this. The authors reject this rationalizing explanation. They say that this couldn't possibly be, this is like a later addition somehow, because Acca Larentia shows up in the mythological record before the story of the wolf. Now, I'm not entirely sure that I buy that, because if she shows up before the wolf does, that doesn't say that the wolf couldn't have been invented out of this whole Lupa debacle. But I do agree with them that her function in the myth is integral because, as they say, quote, "The debased prostitute is the most representative symbol of their savage lifestyle and a key element in their journey to reclaim what is rightfully theirs by origin." And then they go on to describe how the youth of Romulus and Remus in the country and close to nature is a kind of initiation process. Like I said, this is a common thing in myth, to have the heroes removed from their royal context, growing up elsewhere, and then they're kind of initiated and they have to prove themselves to get back to where they belong. Being out in the country and being in a context that is the polar opposite from the royal context gives the heroes a chance to form themselves into what they will become. They have trials by hardship that they wouldn't have otherwise living in the royal context. And it also keeps them out of the palace intrigue, which usually means it keeps them alive. So yeah, whether or not Acca Larentia is a sex worker or just a grieving mother of a stillborn child, she takes the boys in and they grow up in a context of humility, again, hardship, and also being closer to nature, which I think in many cultural traditions considered to be like more sacred than human society. We can get into that another time. So yeah, that's the deal with Acca Larentia. Now, there is also another Acca Larentia in Roman myth, and this was confusing even in antiquity. Some writers say that they're the same woman. Some writers say that they are two different mythological traditions that get merged together. Ancient and modern writers are kind of talking about how this all comes about. So the alternate myth of Acca Larentia is that there was a temple of Hercules in Rome or somewhere near Rome, and the priest who was attending, and by the way, this takes place after Rome already was founded. So there's a temple in the city of Rome or near the city of Rome that has already existed for some time, and this temple is attended by a priest who challenges Hercules to a dice game. And he says, "If I win, you bless me. If I lose, then I have to give you a feast and a beautiful woman to spend the night with." The priest loses, and so he has to put on a feast for Hercules, and he gives her, as promised, a woman who he puts in the temple for that night, and the god visits her. This woman is named Acca Larentia. So that complicates things a little bit. But in this alternate version, you also have the notion that Acca Larentia is in this case, I mean, I don't know what her agency is in this story, but she is, to try and put it as delicately as possible, like doing sex professionally. Whether she's doing it of her own volition or not, I don't know. I don't think it's clear in the sources. But somehow this gets conflated with Romulus and Remus's adoptive mother. Maybe through the sex work thing. Again, I don't know, and nobody else does either. And then to make it even crazier, you have Aulus Gellius. Aulus Gellius's version, as I said, is a total outlier. It is a completely different story, and the only thing that is similar is the fact that Acca Larentia is a sex worker and the fact that Romulus shows up in the story. So, according to Aulus Gellius, Acca Larentia was a prostitute who had 12 sons. She lost one and was mourning. Romulus himself offered himself as a replacement 12th son, and she accepted this, and she made Romulus her heir, and he established himself and his 11 adoptive brothers as the Arval Brethren. This is like one of the prime priesthoods in the Roman state religious apparatus. So it's an origin story for that priesthood, but holy guacamole, what is happening in this version of the story? You can see like the core elements of it. I think it's actually really helpful to have this story because it distills down the most essential parts of Acca Larentia's mythology. The fact that she does sex work. The fact that she lost a child also shows up in this story. Romulus is adopted by Acca Larentia, and then he goes on to be her heir and receive all of her wealth, because she made money, and then he uses all of this to establish the Arval Brethren. So, totally buck wild story. I'm glad we have it. And finally, before we leave Acca Larentia behind, there is a festival called the Larentalia, which is dedicated to her, and it takes place in December. So Plutarch says, "Yet the Romans also sacrificed to her, and in the month of April the priest of Mars pours libations in her honor, and the festival is called the Larentalia." So a priest of Mars, right? That's pretty exciting. And the tragedy of that is that unfortunately we do not have Ovid's Fasti. Instead, what we have at the beginning of book 3, which covers the month of March, where he tells the story of Rhea Silvia and the whole thing, he says, "Let me not fail to mention you, Larentia, nurse of so great a race, nor your help, humble Faustulus. Your tribute will come when I tell of the Larentalia. December, dear to the Genii, has that festival." So that is the story of the three mothers of Romulus and Remus. Rhea Silvia, also called Ilia, the wolf who finds them in the wild, and Acca Larentia, the farmer's wife who may have been a sex worker, who may also be an entirely different woman altogether. So what can we say about this story? What does this tell us? What do we get out of it by looking at these three women/womanly figures, I don't know what you'd call the wolf, who are present in the life of Romulus and Remus? So the first thing to note about this story is that it exists in a rich and wide and varied literary tradition. Even within the story we saw so much variation, but an absolutely critical thing to understand is that this story does not exist in isolation. You can't take it and read it in isolation and still understand how it came to be the way that it is. The authors who write this story are constantly in dialogue with other stories that have similar features that get adopted into the Romulus and Remus story to make it the versions, plural, that we have today. So I want to start off our analysis by looking at some of the mythological elements that show up in this story and comparing them to other stories. The first set, I'm going to group kind of a few different things together. the notion that the boy's birth was prophesied, or that there was somehow information delivered to the mother that their children would be special. Also, the fact that they come from royal origins, which I think speaks for itself, and the notion that their mother is a virgin. So when you think of a virgin mother, obviously Mary is going to come to mind first. But I bring her up not just to say that she was a virgin who hadn't consummated her marriage with Joseph yet, and that she becomes pregnant and gives birth to a child that turns out to be the son of a god, in this case, the god. What I really want to talk about is the account in the Gospel of Luke that says that an angel came to Mary and explained to her what was going to happen. So Luke says this: "The angel Gabriel was sent to a virgin betrothed to a man named Joseph. Then the angel said to her, 'Behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall name him Jesus. He will be great, and will be called Son of the Most High.' But Mary said to the angel, 'How can this be, since I have no relations with a man?' And the angel said to her in reply, 'The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God.'" And then Matthew says she was found with child through the Holy Spirit, and also an angel appears to Joseph to convince him that everything is fine and not to divorce her. So I skipped over this a little bit when talking about Rhea Silvia, but some versions of the Rhea Silvia story, like I said, she's visited in a dream either by Mars or by her father Aeneas, who explains that her children will be great. So in Aeneas, for example, she's telling the story. She says, "Then it was father, Aeneas, who seemed to lift up his voice and speak to me in these words: 'O daughter, first there are hardships to be borne by you, but after that your fortunes will rise again from a river.'" And of course, this is the exposure and the whole thing. And by the way, just a side note about the Aeneas version, there's a council of the gods that we don't have much of, evidently, where Jupiter assures Mars that his children will be okay, but only one of them will be deified, and Jupiter orders the Tiber to subside and, save the children. Anyway, that's Aeneas. Dionysius of Halicarnassus says, "And they say that the ravisher, Mars, to comfort the maiden, by which it became clear that it was a god, commanded her not to grieve at all at what had happened, since she had been united in marriage to the divinity of the place, that is the grove of Mars, and as a result of her violation should bear 2 sons who would far excel all men in valor and warlike achievements. And having said this, he was wrapped in a cloud, and being lifted from the earth was borne upwards through the air." And the Origogentis: "She was immediately restored by the consolation of the god, who was indicating his name, and affirming that from her would be born an offspring worthy of their father." Now, the story of Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ, is written down much later than many of these versions. So we can't say that the Romulus and Remus story is borrowing from the Mary story. I just want to say that they're all in a tradition together. So in that spirit, let's look at a way older version that comes from Homer's Odyssey. So in Book 11, Odysseus has to visit the underworld to get a whole bunch of information, and he sees a lot of other people along the way, including the ghost of Achilles, and this woman, Tyro. And the deal with Tyro is that Tyro was in love with the river god Enipeus, and the god Poseidon wanted her, so he disguised himself as Enipeus, and then she became pregnant. But check it out. This is what Homer says. Odysseus is narrating here. "And the first I saw there, Tyro, born of kings, who said her father was that great lord Salmoneus, and that she was the wife of Cretheus, Aeolus' son. Aeolus is a god of winds. And once she fell in love with the river god Enipeus, far the clearest river flowing across the earth, and so she'd haunt Enipius's glinting streams, till taking his shape one day, the god who girds the earth and makes it tremble, that is Poseidon, bedded her where the swirling river rushes out to sea, and a surging wave reared up, high as a mountain, dark, arching over to hide the god and mortal girl together. Loosing her virgin belt, he lapped her round in sleep, and when the god had consummated his work of love, he took her by the hand and hailed her warmly. "Rejoice in our love, my lady, and when this year has run its course, you will give birth to glorious children. Bedding down with the gods is never barren or futile, and you must tend them, breed and rear them well. Now home you go, and restrain yourself, I say. Never breathe your lover's name, but know I am Poseidon, god who rocks the earth." With that, he dove back in the heaving waves, and she conceived for the god and bore him Pelias, Neleus, and both grew up to be stalwart aids of Zeus Almighty, both men alike. So Pelias and Neleus are the sons of Tyro, and Tyro goes on to have other children with other men, including Aeson, the father of Jason, and Pelias and Aeson are fighting over the throne of Iolcus, and Jason is sent to go be reared by Chiron, and on and on and on. So again, just parallel after parallel after parallel. But the story of Tyro, a daughter of a royal line, who is a virgin, stated outright in the text, who is in love with a river god, who is assaulted in her sleep by a god, like a big capital G god, Poseidon, who then bears twins and is assured by prophecy that they are going to be special. I don't know how you get past that comparison. Even more than the Mary story, that is like a clear comparison in my mind to the Rhea Silvia story. It even has the element of the river. Moving on to the trope of children being exposed at birth or otherwise nursed by animals. Again, I'm grouping those things together closely. You could name a zillion of these, and in fact, there is an article written by Giulia Pedrucci which catalogs even more examples of this type of story. But just to give a few examples here, and I'm sure you could come up with even more because this is so common. Let's start with a fragmentary text from the 7th century BCE, so very, very, very old, which supposedly is the autobiography of Sargon of Akkad. This is a ruler, an Akkadian ruler. He says, "My mother was a high priestess. My father I knew not. The brothers of my father loved the hills. My city is Azupiranu, which is situated on the banks of the Euphrates. My high priestess mother conceived me. In secret she bore me. She sent me in a basket of rushes, with bitumen she sealed my lid. She cast me into the river, which rose over me. The river bore me up, and carried me to Aki, the drawer of water. Aki, the drawer of water, took me as his son, and reared me. Aki, the drawer of water, appointed me as his gardener. While I was a gardener, Ishtar granted me her love, and for 4 years, and it breaks off, and then it ends up, years I exercised kingship." So, a child born from a high priestess. Not the priestess of Vesta, but some kind of high priestess, who had a child in secret, sent him up a river in a basket, and he did not die. He was adopted by a drawer of water who gave him a job as a gardener, and then he himself was visited by a goddess, the goddess Ishtar, and they have a relationship, and then something happens, I don't really know what, and then Sargon becomes king. You could compare this even to the story of Moses, which everybody basically knows. Then there's a kind of weird one. And the thing about this version is that it's later, it comes from an unknown writer, pseudo-Plutarch, we call him. This just means that some people have attributed this story to Plutarch because it is a representation of parallel stories, and Plutarch has his parallel lives, but other people think that it's probably not Plutarch. But it's later than the Romulus and Remus story. It's a one-off as far as I know. We only have one source, and it's short. It's just like a paragraph. It is the story of Parrhasius and Lycastus. Parrhasius and Lycastus are twins from Arcadia, the sons of Ares, the god of war, and Philonome, a mortal woman who is the companion of Artemis, the famous virgin huntress goddess. And these two boys, the twins, were exposed as infants by being thrown into a river, and they were nursed by a she-wolf, and then they later went on to rule Arcadia. My assumption, and please tell me if you have more information about this, my assumption is that this story is based on the Romulus and Remus story very directly and very clearly. The connection with the she-wolf, the connection with them being the sons of Mars, the fact that they are rulers of Arcadia. I'll get into the Arcadia thing in just a second, but that's like also a very Romulus and Remus kind of a thing. So I don't think you can take this as evidence that the Romulus and Remus story is based on this. I think it's the other way around. But you see how the same themes come up over and over and over and over again. Children being born illegitimately, potentially from virgins, who are themselves royal or at least priestesses, and being exposed, usually on a river, usually in a basket, and then they wash up and they're taken in by somebody or some other animal after that. And I'm sure, as I said, you can think of even more. The next theme that I want to talk about is the Sylvan theme, the forest, nature, wolf theme that I mentioned before. And this is also connected to the place of Arcadia, where that myth that I just mentioned, the Parrhasius and Lycastus myth, comes from. Or at least they say it comes from Arcadia. Like I said in the beginning, Rhea Silvia's name, Silvia, yes, it's a family name, but Silva means forest, so already the boys are in the forest. And I've mentioned a little bit how their exposure to nature and their living close to nature forms an initiation for the heroes to become who they are supposed to be. The connection goes further, though, because you have the addition of the wolf. Then you have the connection to Arcadia. So Arcadia is a place in Greece, and in Roman early proto-founder mythology, there was a colony in Italy, in Latium, that was founded by a guy named Evander, who came from Arcadia. And he brought with him the worship of the god Pan, who is a Sylvan god, who gets related to Silvanus, and also to Faunus, who is another kind of woodland deity. So in Dionysius of Halicarnassus, as I read to you before, but I'll put it back up on the screen here, when the wolf gets approached by all of these farmers who can't believe what they're seeing, she doesn't run away, but she calmly goes to this sacred spot which the Arcadians had founded in honor of the god Pan/Faunus /Silvanus, and on and on. And the worship of these gods, this kind of synchronized god, we'll just call him Pan for now, the worship of this god is also reflected in the Roman festival of Lupercalia, which I haven't talked about what happens after the boys grow up, but when the boys grow up, they reclaim the throne for their grandfather Numitor. And in a lot of versions, this takes place when they, as young men, are celebrating the Lupercalia festival, which is a festival dedicated to wolves. You can hear it in the name Lupercalia, Lupa, and it's a fertility ritual. It has young men going around and, first of all, getting bathed in blood and all kinds of crazy stuff, smacking women with strips of leather to increase their fertility. But as the boys, Romulus and Remus, are celebrating this festival, that is the event that kicks off the battle between them and Amulius eventually. they get arrested and they get thrown in prison, or Remus gets thrown in prison, and, it's a whole thing. But all of that to say that it's related to this Arcadia, wolfy, woodlandy kind of theme. And to take another quote from that Virgins and Prostitutes article, they say, "The savage brotherhood of the naked Luperci and their pastoral god Faunus stand in close relation to Mars as the father of the twins and the symbol of the she-wolf," which is much more succinct and eloquent than all of the stuff that I just said. But that's a theme in this story, and it carries throughout the different versions of it. I want to end with what to me is the most obvious comparison to the Romulus and Remus story, and that is the birth of Cyrus from Herodotus' Histories. I'm going to read you a significant chunk of this because I think just by reading it, after everything that we've discussed, you will immediately see every part of the Romulus and Remus story, or most parts of the Romulus and Remus story, represented. Clearly, the Romulus and Remus story is in dialogue with this. So I'm going to read it to you. It's pretty long. I might skip over some parts, but just take a listen to what he says. "Now Astyages had a daughter whose name was Mandane. And Astyages saw her in a dream making water so greatly that she filled all his city and flooded, besides, all of Asia. He confided this dream to those of the Magi who were dream interpreters, and when he learned the particulars of their exposition, he feared greatly. When Mandane was ripe for a man, Astyages, since he dreaded his dream, gave her to no one of the Medes who were worthy to marry into his house, but to a Persian called Cambyses, whom he found to be a man of good house and peaceable temper. And he thought this Persian was much below a Mede of even middle class. When Mandane was living with her husband in their first year, Astyages saw another vision. It seemed to him that out of his daughter's privy parts there grew a vine, and that vine shaded all of Asia. This then he saw, and again he entrusted the matter to the dream interpreters, and sent to recall his daughter from where she lived among the Persians, she then being big with child. When she came, he kept her under ward, because he wished to destroy whatever should be born of her. For from his vision, the interpreters among the Magi had read the signs to mean that the child of his daughter would become king in his place. It was against this that Astyages guarded. And so when Cyrus was born, he summoned Harpagus, his kinsman, the faithfulest of the Medes and the steward of all he had. Harpagus, he said, here is a matter I am entrusting to you. By no means mishandle it, nor yet deceive me and choose others. Take this child that Mandane bore, and bring it to your own house and kill it, and afterwards bury it in whatever way you please. Harpagus answered, My lord, never yet have you seen even a hint of what is untoward in me, and I shall give heed that in the time to come too I shall not offend against you. If it is your pleasure that this be so, then it shall be mine to serve you duly. So Harpagus answered him. When the baby was given him, all decked out for his death, Harpagus went weeping to his house, and on coming there, he told his wife all the story that Astyages had told him. And now what is in your mind to do? She asked. Certainly not what Astyages has ordered me, was his answer. Not though he shall be even more frantic and mad than now he is, will I fall in with his judgment and be his servant in such a murder. There are many reasons why I will not murder the child. Because he is akin to me, and because Astyages is an old man, and childless in male issue. If it should happen that after his death the crown should devolve upon his daughter, whose son Astyages has killed by my hands, what is left for me from then on but the greatest peril? Yet for my own safety the child must die, but it must be one of Astyages' folk that will be its murderer, and none of mine. So he said, and at once sent a messenger to that one of Astyages' herdsmen, whom he knew to graze his flocks in the pastures most suitable for his purpose, and in mountains where wild beasts were most common. The man's name was Mithridates, and he lived with a woman who was a slave like himself, and was called in Greek Kaino, and in Median Spako, for the Medians call a bitch Spako. When the herdsman arrived in great haste at his summons, Harpagus said, "It is Astyages' command to you that you take this child and expose it on the loneliest part of the hills, that it may the soonest perish. And he has ordered me to tell you that if you do not kill it, but in any way bear a hand in its survival, he will cause you yourself to die the most terrible of deaths. I myself have instructions to supervise the child's exposure." When the herdsman heard this, he took up the baby and went the same road home until he came to his steading. Now his own wife was near her time all that day, and, as God would somehow have it so, she gave birth when her husband had gone to the city. They were much in one another's thoughts, these two, for the man was afraid for his wife in labor, and the woman for her man, whom Harpagus in so unaccustomed a fashion had summoned to his presence. Then he came back and stood before her, and the woman, as the sight of him was unexpected, was the first to ask him why Harpagus had been so instant in sending for him. The herdsman said, "Wife, I came to the city and saw and heard something I wish I had not seen, nor that it should have happened to our masters. For the whole house of Harpagus was in a tumult of lamentation, and I went into it bewildered. When I came in, I saw a baby lying there, struggling and crying. He was decked out with gold ornaments, and his clothes were finely embroidered. When Harpagus saw me, he bade me take up the child speedily, and go and expose it on the hills where the beasts are thickest. He said it was Astyages who had laid these commands on me, and he added many threats if I should disobey. I took up the child and bore it here, thinking it must be from one of the household, since I had no inkling where it should have come from. But I marveled to see the gold and the raiment and the lamentation so manifest in Harpagus' house. As I came along the road, I learned the whole story from one of the servants, who escorted me out of the city and put the baby into my hands. He said it was the child of Mandane, the daughter of Astyages and of Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, and that it was Astyages' command that it should be killed. So now here it is." Even as he spoke, the herdsman took the covering from the baby and showed it to her. When his wife saw the child so big and beautiful, she burst into tears, and taking her man by the knees, she besought him by no means to expose it. He said he could not do otherwise, for spies were to come from Harpagus to oversee the matter, and the herdsman would die a cruel death if he disobeyed. So when the woman could not persuade her man, she said next, "Since I cannot persuade you not to expose it, you must do this, if a child must necessarily be exposed. I too have given birth, and the baby I bore was dead. Take the dead boy and expose it. Let us bring up as our own this child of Astyages' daughter. So you will not be detected in cheating our masters, and we shall ourselves have arranged our business well enough. For the dead child will have a royal burial, and the survivor will not lose his life." The herdsman thought that his wife counseled very well in his present trouble, and he immediately did as she said. The child he had brought, and of whom he should have been the deathsman, he confided to his wife. But his own child that was dead he took up and placed in the box wherein he had brought the other. He put on the dead body all the ornaments of that other child, and bore it off to the loneliest parts of the hills, and left it there. When the third day came on the exposed child, the herdsman went to the city, leaving one of his underlings to guard it, and he came to the house of Harpagus, and said he was ready to show him the body. Harpagus sent some of the trustiest of his bodyguard, and through their agency saw and buried the body that was the herdsman's child, so that one was buried, and he that afterwards was called Cyrus was taken over by the herdsman's wife and brought up by her, though of course she put another name on him and not Cyrus. And then Cyrus goes on to grow up in the countryside and eventually to take his rightful place as ruler of the Medes. Now, I think most of this speaks for itself, but in case you missed what I think is the most exciting detail of this story, they say that the herdsman's wife was named Kino, or in Median, Spako, and that this is the name of a dog. Kino in Greek is dog. And in ancient Greek, this was slang for a sexually liberated woman, a professional sex worker, or just a woman who slept around. Obviously, there is some connection here to the Romulus and Remus story. So I think maybe more clearly than any of the other examples, this demonstrates how the Romulus and Remus story is part of a tradition. Parts of other stories are borrowed and reworked to create the beginning of a Roman cultural identity. So yeah, just really, really exciting. If you want to dig further into this story and analysis of it, I can recommend a couple of articles to take a look at. I mentioned already the one about virgins and prostitutes by two scholars named Chaste and Vukovic. I'm sure I'm saying those wrong. I do sincerely apologize. And like I said in the beginning, this is an analysis of 3 separate incidents from Roman mythohistory and actual history, where writers talk about 2 women, one a virgin, usually a Vestal, and one a prostitute, who are treated together in a story and somehow both contribute and are honored by the Roman people because they save the Roman people or they are contributed to the Roman people. This article also put me on to the river connection because the river part of the story goes beyond Rhea Silvia and shows up in other stories as well. Next, we have an article by Tom Stevenson called Women of Early Rome as Exempla in Livy ab Urbe Condita, Book 1. So this is an overview of the women that show up in Livy's account in particular. And I like this article because it asks a number of interesting questions about the ambiguity of the father of Romulus and Remus, whether it's Mars or Amulius or somebody else. So some things that Stevenson brings up: could Rhea Silvia have lied, as Livy suggests, and potentially compromised her vows, in which case the founders would be illegitimate children? If Rhea Silvia is making the Mars thing up, that means that Romulus and Remus are bastards, which changes the story entirely. Stevenson also wonders, how bad was Amulius exactly? If he's the father, I think we talked about this a little bit, but if he's the father, that brings a much darker tone to the entire story. They're still illegitimate, although they're born from royalty, but it takes a usurper and a power-hungry jerk and turns him into a total monster. And then the last thing about Acca Larentia and the Lupa, quote, this, meaning connecting Acca Larentia's lifestyle to the terminology of Lupa, this effectively undermines the boy's paternity for a second time, given the claim of Rhea Silvia had been qualified earlier. The reader is forced to contemplate far less epic origins for the twins, and then indeed for Rome, than might be done in other circumstances. The narrative of Rome's foundation becomes increasingly less stable. Not only are the boys raised by humble people, farmers, maybe even enslaved farmers or herdsmen, and not only do they grow up outside of the royal context, closer to nature, but if their adoptive mother is a sex worker, then again, that changes the story. So I thought that was a really great article, and I can recommend that you read that one as well. I also looked at Catherine Connors' article called Aeneas, Ovid, and Representations of Ilia. So this put me onto the Tyro story from Homer about the woman who was in love with the river god Enipeus, and who gave birth to Pelias and Neleus as a result of her tryst with Poseidon. Connors also pointed out that in the version from Ovid's Amores, which I read to you, before he gets into Ilia talking to the river Anio and lamenting about her vows being broken, he tells all these other stories about women who were involved with rivers, and he mentions Tyro, but he doesn't call her Tyro, he calls her Salmonis, which is a patronymic which just means daughter of Salmoneus, and I missed that, so Connors pointed that out. So, not that Catherine Connors is watching, but thank you, Catherine Connors, for pointing that out. And lastly, I mentioned the article by Julia Pedrucci, which lists all of the other examples, and maybe not even all, but many, many, many other examples of children who were exposed and nursed by animals. So all of these are linked in the description. Most of them are on JSTOR. And again, if you make a free account, you can just read them and it's great. So that's some preliminary reading. As always, I mostly read the ancient sources for this, but these articles should get you started. So, in conclusion, at long last, what I take away from this story, what sticks out to me immediately as one of the most clear and important parts of the story is the symmetry between Rhea Silvia and Acca Larentia. I'm going to leave the wolf out for a minute. Rhea Silvia comes from a royal family. She is a virgin, in fact a Vestal virgin, who has her virginity taken from her. Most sources say outright or imply that it was non-consensual. Her pregnancy is unsuccessfully denied. Her motherhood is inevitable. Dio says, quote, "It is impossible for mortal man either to foresee all that is to happen or to find a way of turning aside the inevitable. Of this very maiden, Rhea Silvia, were to be born the avengers of his, Amulius's, crime." Amulius could not make her a Vestal and get away with it. Her becoming a mother was inevitable. Livy also says something like this. He says, "But the fates had, I believe, already decreed the origin of this great city and the foundation of the mightiest empire under heaven." So no matter what, despite the fact that she's a Vestal, she is meant to bear these children. And yet, when she does, her children are taken from her. So even though her becoming a mother is inevitable, she loses that motherhood after the children are born. Acca Larentia, on the other hand, is of a lower class status, either a shepherd's wife or a slave in her own right. And she's not a virgin. In fact, many sources name her as a sex worker or at the very least a sexually liberated woman. And even if you don't believe any of that, the fact that she is already married means that she is no longer a virgin. Her pregnancy is not denied, but her children are taken from her before she gets to be their mother. She bears her child, but it's a stillborn child, and so she loses out on being their mother, much like Rhea Silvia loses out on being the mother of Romulus and Remus. But Acca Larentia becomes a mother anyway. Like Rhea Silvia, her motherhood is inevitable, because even though her child died, she gets new children to raise. These two represent two sides of the socioeconomic spectrum, two sides of the female sexual experience in antiquity, and their maternal stories are inverted. Rhea Silvia becomes a mother, but loses her children. Acca Larentia loses her child, but gains more children. For both of them, their motherhood is inevitable. And for the wolf, her motherhood is natural. She's not thinking about palace intrigue or getting in trouble with anybody when she does what she does. She's just doing what is natural. So that's the story of the three mothers of Romulus and Remus. I hope that you found this useful. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, you can let me know by leaving a thumbs up down below. And please let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm anxious to hear of any other versions of this story that you know about, any other comparisons that you can think of with other stories from Greek and Roman mythology or even beyond the Greek and Roman world. And I would love to hear your thoughts about the women, the mothers themselves, the women and the wolf. What do you think about this story? What do you take out of it? And maybe what does it say about Rome as it's constructing its identity around this tale? Now, of course, the foundation myth goes on to explain the life of Romulus, the founding of Rome, all of the kings of Rome, the trouble with Lucretia and the overthrow of the monarchy, and on and on and on and on. But this right here is the very beginning of it all, unless you count Aeneas. It's a very important story, is what I'm trying to say. So anyway, I'm gonna wrap this up. I'm getting a little punchy. I've been at it for a couple of hours, so I'll just say thank you for watching. If you like this content, feel free to subscribe to the channel. This is the kind of stuff that we do here, all about what ancient Greek and Roman writers said about their beliefs. And that's it. Thanks again, and I will see you next time.